Today, what we're going to be talking about is how to safely and properly operate the miter saw. This particular miter saw happens to be a sliding compound miter saw. So it can do three different types of cuts. We can do a regular 90-degree cross cut, a miter, or a bevel. A couple of things you want to remember though before we start operating any piece of power equipment is we always want to have our safety glasses on. You want to remove any jewelry such as rings, watches, or bracelets. You also want to make sure you restrain long hair and loose clothing. So a lot of times people are wearing hoodies. You want to make sure you either don't have strings or they're tucked in. Sleeves should be rolled up. And if you have long hair, it should be tied back into a ponytail or pushed up into a hat. Some more specific safety that pertains more to the miter saw. We want to make sure that you're keeping your hands 6 inches, away from all moving parts, especially the blade. So on most miter saws, that happens to be about the distance from where the blade enters the table to the edge of the circular portion. So we can see right here with a tape measure, that is in fact 6 inches. Most miter saws also have small warning labels that indicate where you don't want your hands. So we don't want our hands past this little warning label here. On the miter saw, we are only going to be doing cross cuts. What a cross cut is if we're looking at a piece of wood. A cross cut goes across the grain. So we can see on here we have these faint lines that are actually part of the wood. We want to cut only across the piece like that. We're never going to do a rip cut. A rip cut is one that goes in the same direction as those lines. So rip cuts can cause all kinds of issues when you're using a miter saw, especially if you're inexperienced. Another reminder as you're operating the miter saw is that we always need to have a functional guard. So for this guard to function correctly, as I operate it and push the blade down into the workpiece, this plastic guard pulls up out of the way. Sometimes you may find that somebody has either removed this guard or they have tied it back in some way. Either one of those cases, you should not be operating this machine until that is functioning correctly. So we have a couple different types of cuts that I talked about earlier that we'll be able to do on the miter saw. We can do a 90-degree straight cut or a square. We can do a miter, and we can also do a bevel. The first one I'm going to demonstrate today is going to be a 90-degree straight cut. On this particular piece that we're going to be demonstrating with today, we know that already that we can see our grain, which is running down the length of this board. So all of our cuts are going to go across it in one way or another. Either straight across for a 90-degree square cut, at an angle for a miter, or at an angle this way if we were doing a bevel cut. So for starters, we can see that the end of this board is nowhere near 90 degrees. So that's what we're going to first start with, is doing a 90-degree straight cut. In order to know where and how to properly set up that cut, we're going to use a tool such as a combination square here to mark out a 90-degree cut. So to do that, we make sure the head, which is this gray portion, is tight against one of the edges of the board. Then we'll use pencil, always pencil with woodworking so that it's easier to remove. If we have ink, it tends to stain the piece and is much more difficult to remove. So we now have a 90-degree line across that board. So we'll be doing a cross cut here. When we operate the miter saw, and this goes for all types of cuts, we're always going to start in this furthest back position. Before we actually start the cut, we're going to line up to the right side or the scrap side of the line. As you can see here, we line up on that right side of the line so that we are cutting it to the correct size. So once we have lined up the cut, in this position all the way back, we would squeeze the trigger to turn the machine on. Some machines, like the one that we have at school, have a little safety mechanism. Again, it's different on all different machines. This is a slightly older machine, so it doesn't have a safety mechanism for the trigger. At this point, we would squeeze that trigger and start the machine up. We would pull it out and drop it down into the table. Now I'm going to move the piece out of the way today to simulate that. As this machine is running, I'm going to push it all the way toward the back while it's also pushed all the way down into the table. Once I reach the end of my cut, I will release the switch and wait for the machine to completely stop before lifting the blade from the table. Once it's stopped, we can safely pick it up out of the table, and then you can remove your good piece and the scrap piece, which will be over here on the right side of the table. So now we'll actually demonstrate and show you a cut. So in review, we're going to first line up to the right side of the line. I'll start the machine and make my cut. My left hand is always over on this left side, pushing the piece down against the table and in toward the fence. And then I can lift the blade out of the table. The next cut that we're going to demonstrate today is a miter cut. So for a miter cut, that is an angled cut that goes across the grain of the piece. First thing that we're going to do is, if we demonstrate a 45-degree miter, we need to mark out a 45-degree. For this, we're going to use the combination square. So from the head to the blade here is 45 degrees. So we make sure the head is against one of the edges of the board, and the blade stretches across the piece. We then mark out that line with a pencil so that it's easier to remove later. And now we have a 45-degree line drawn on the piece. In order to accurately make this cut, we need to now rotate the table of the miter saw to 45 degrees. Each miter saw is a little bit different, but most have some type of locking mechanism on the front of the table. On this particular saw, I pull up and squeeze the small trigger in order to rotate. So we are going to rotate in to 45 degrees. If you look very closely, there's always some type of indicator on the machine that allows you to know exactly what degree we are set at. Just like a 90-degree straight cut, what we're going to do is line up on the scrap side of the cut, or of the line, rather than the good side. So for this case, my scrap side is going to be over on the right. So that means that my saw, the blade, is going to be lined up on the right side of the line. From here, it's all going to be very similar to your 90-degree straight cuts. With your left hand, you're going to provide pressure down against the table, and you're also going to be pushing in toward the vertical support, which is called the fence. We'll start the machine in an all the way back position. We'll pull it out, plunge down in, make your cut while pushing back, and then slide it, and then wait until it stops spinning to remove it from the table. Always make sure you have also locked in at the 90-degree, or at the angle that you're to be set at. So to demonstrate now, we'll start it up. And bring it up out of the table. The last cut that we're going to demonstrate today is a bevel cut. A bevel cut is a cut that cuts at an angle in this direction here. To line up and mark out for a bevel cut, we're going to do exactly the same as we did with a 90-degree straight cut. So we'll have a line that goes across the piece, since we only do cross cuts on the miter saw. And then the angled portion is going to be set on the machine. For today's demonstration, we're going to set it to a 15-degree bevel. To do that, again, this varies on all machines, but a lot of times the bevel is adjusted in the back of the machine. So on this machine, it is this big knob on the back side. We'll loosen the knob and then check the indicator normally toward the back of the machine. We're going to line up at 15 degrees for today's demonstration, and then lock it back in place. Just like the other two previous cuts that we demonstrated today, we'll line up on the scrap side of the line. We'll start the machine with it all the way in the back, squeeze the trigger, pull it out, and push all the way back. Again, you are always providing pressure down against the table and in against the fence. You never want to have any gap between the piece and the fence. So to demonstrate, start up the machine. And then we can lift it up out of the table. Cuts at an angle across the piece. In review, one of the biggest things that you need to remember about the miter saw is that we are always cutting across the grain. We are never going to cut with the grain. You want to make sure your fingers and hands and all other body parts stay at least 6 inches outside, away from the blade. On most machines, that is to keep it out of the circular portion of the table. There is almost always little warning labels on your machine. When we're performing a cut, we want to make sure you are providing firm pressure down against the table and in against the fence. The blade starts at the very back. We drop into the cut, push all the way back, and wait until the blade stops spinning before you remove it from the table. You always want to make sure you're taking care of your personal safety items, making sure you're wearing your safety glasses at all times. You don't have any jewelry on, especially on your hands. Don't have gloves on. And then you also want to make sure you restrain long hair, loose clothing, things like hoodies, strings, roll-up sleeves, headphone wires. Those are all bad things to have while operating the miter saw. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll be ready to use the miter saw when we return back to school.